Hey, welcome back to another Bitcoin Reformation podcast. I'm Ben Haupt, joined with Townley and David Rufner to talk a little bit more about Bitcoin. Jared, how you doing today?
We are well here in Pennsylvania. Fall is finally descending on us. I know this will be a little bit later coming out, but it's early October. Trees are starting to turn. It was 40 degrees this morning on my run. Absolutely love it. It's amazing. I think the craziest thing that I would have never had on my checklist this past weekend. So if you remember, maybe 2 months ago, was it? Or a month or so ago? Former President Donald Trump was attempted to be assassinated in basically our backyard here, where we live currently, and very scary for our community. And so he was back again this weekend, but brought with him Elon Musk. And like that fact alone is the crazy part. Like, sure, former president, that's a big deal, but like bringing Mr. Techman himself, Elon Musk, to our small little dinky town. Forgive me if you're listening from around here, but not a place that I might say Elon Musk is going to show up randomly to, but just kind of a wild, yes, I guess he's a normal person who can travel everywhere, but I don't think that he would come here. So just kind of one of those weird things. In our family life together, school is going well for our eldest. The youngest is getting bigger every day, running around, trying to do everything his sister is doing. I don't feel like I have any particularly funny stories. The kids are cute. I love them. I like when they sing to me Jesus songs. That's all I got. David, what's up with you?
Yeah, we are. It's a Tuesday that we're recording. We're fresh back Monday afternoon from Phoenix. So we went to Phoenix. Being my wife, younger two children, and I, we have a text thread. I've called us the Final Four in the text thread. That's the name of it. But we went to Phoenix to visit son number two, who is at school at Grand Canyon University. So we got to see him. Our younger kids got to see Phoenix for the first time, as well as GCU. And it was like 113 degrees there. We broke a record in October while we were there, and it just wasn't spectacular for it to be that hot. Our son, though, at GCU, he said, "Oh man, I didn't know it was this hot out here." Because when we came, he's walking everywhere with us, whereas the thing on big college campuses these days are electric scooters. And so he has one as well. And he hasn't really walked anywhere on campus since he got there, is what I understand that to mean. And so he just kind of discovered himself how warm it is. But we had a good time there. Glad to be home. Ate at what has become a favorite little restaurant of ours in Phoenix. So if anybody listens to this in the Phoenix area, it's called The Porch. If I had to pick like a backyard burger place for a beer and just that burger, wings, and the like, The Porch in Phoenix might be it. So there's my travel eat recommendation for the show.
Yeah, we're doing well. The boys continue to grow. Noah is 14 now, so we have true teenagers, and very quickly we'll have one in college and one in high school. So we're just doing a lot of, it's senior year of high school, so doing a lot of last minute college visits and trying to figure this out. But other than that, we're great. We're loving that fall is here, and that means kind of a travel season for me. PLI has a lot of learning communities going on this fall, but that's a lot of fun. I'm loving this new role, this new call, and so yeah, life is good. Well, we're going to dive into an episode today where what I'd like to do is kind of trace the heritage of the Reformation from Martin Luther and the reformers around him, because Luther wasn't the only reformer. From Luther and the reformers all the way to the cypherpunks that create Bitcoin. And it's not just like the cypherpunks sat down and read Martin Luther. In fact, I'm pretty sure that they did not, although there are some possible indications that maybe some of the creators of Bitcoin knew something about dates like October 31st when the Bitcoin white paper gets presented, and maybe that's a hat tip to Martin Luther, although there's not really a whole lot more than just the date coincidence to point to. Instead, what I want to do is show that the thinking of the Reformation really has, in several key time periods, been come forth, and it's especially this. And listener, I want to see if you would recognize this moment in our world today. It's when there are a lot of common people who feel like they don't have power to lead their life out in a normal way, and there's some kind of big ruling power that seems to be really coercive and using their power instead of for service. The ruling power uses it to coerce people, and people become afraid of how much power is centralized into one office. So I'll just, maybe that's just a rhetorical question. I'm sure you could probably list off lots of ways that you're maybe displeased with ruling authorities and such. We've talked a little bit on this podcast about central banks being one of those centralizing authoritative forces, but that's the plan today, is to trace the heritage of the Reformation from the reformers all the way to modern day. David, Jared, does that sound okay with you?
Sounds good to me. I'd be curious maybe if you share a little like where, because I'm curious sort of how the conversation went or where this came from. Like where did the seed get planted?
Yeah, in some ways, I started down this path actually when I was teaching a class on revitalization, which is a topic specifically for a lot of pastors, and a lot of lay leaders in churches are interested in this topic. Revitalization typically is a word used to talk about how we want to take a church that feels like it's kind of maybe dying, or it's kind of lost its way, and we want to see it kind of brought back to life. And as I was writing this course for some students at Concordia Seminary, I was trying to figure out how revitalization as a topic might sit with Luther. And I came across the idea that what Luther was trying to do very much was to revitalize the church, but he used the word reformation. And as I started to think about that, I started to take all these authors that I'd been reading, like Yuval Levine, and Yuval Levine was maybe the biggest one, but I'll mention some of these authors through as I'm trying to trace this history. I'm just kind of a amateur historian of, I don't know, kind of politics and political theology, political philosophy. So I've been reading all these things, and it just dawned on me like, hey, these kind of connect. And then I started realizing like, whoa, these people were reading each other, and it's not just me like making up this, what seems to be kind of a line of progress or a line of thinking. It's actually a real thing. And so I'll try to bring that about and try to convince you that I'm not just making it up, that in many ways we could say Luther was a part of the creation of Bitcoin. So that might be my central claim for the podcast, and we'll see if we can pull it off.
It's going to be fun to have you take us here in just moments, Ben, because if you spend some time listening to the Bitcoin community, and maybe not so much right this moment because we're headed into a bear market and so much seems to be about looking forward, but there's different times in the 4-year cycle where different topics come up. And one that comes up, I said something, I misspoke something.
You said we're heading into a bear market. Jared,
Yeah, I did. Fair. We're headed into a bull market, whether we correct that or leave that, and we're looking ahead. But it's likened to several things. I'm trying to think who wrote it. Said Bitcoin is like the settling of the American West. That's one of them. And that's interesting. It's a great paper. It's sort of the land grab and the innovation that went along with that, the robust individualism, which was also open to community, but started with the sovereign individual, you could say. So we've got that. But another one that's reached for quite often, Ben, and it's good, you and I, the three of us know this, but others may not, is the Reformation itself. that there is a shift in the very fabric of culture itself, or it's certainly the theological world. In this case, they're holding up the Reformation and the shift, and even the break from the centralizing entities of the Roman Catholic Church at the time to something new. And they use that as some sort of comparative analog for what's happening here with money technology. So it's reached for quite often, but ultimately, I've never seen it reached for by a Lutheran pastor interested in Bitcoin, or a Lutheran theologian at that, Ben. So this should be a fun journey, and kind of takes on a bit more seriousness in that case, what you're attempting to do for us here.
Well, and what I will say, David, following up on that a hat tip, and I have done this on Twitter or X already, but I hope that I'm not going to butcher his name, but I would pronounce it Tour de Meester. Tour wrote this paper about Bitcoin and likened it to a Reformation. And so he wrote that paper, I think maybe in like 2018 or 2019. And I had signaled to him that we were starting a podcast called Bitcoin Reformation Podcast. So again, a hat tip to Tour that got us thinking about this, and hopefully I can add a little bit to the conversation. So let's get started by just talking a little bit about the Reformation in general. Lutherans like to think that the Reformation started in 1517, but I've been reading another work that I'll talk about in a second that actually claimed that the Reformation really gets going with John Witt in England, who is the first person to say we need an English Bible, not a Latin Bible. And it's actually after Wycliffe gets interested in that Jan Hus and some of the reformers in Prague also get then interested in Reformation. So John Wycliffe's dates is his death date. So he's living 150 years before Luther. Well, 200 years before Luther's birth, right? Luther's born in 1483. Jan Hus is, let's see what his dates are here real quick. Jan Hus is living in what we would call the Czech Republic, or Prague, Bohemia, it was called back in the day. His dates are 1369 to 1415. So again, also living before Luther. Luther references some of these reformers before him, but he recognizes, I just recently read Luther's letter to the Bohemian Christians. That's dated 1523. It's a fascinating read if you're thinking about the question of, can churches call their own pastor, and what if churches can't get a pastor from the centralized system and they need to go elsewhere for a pastor? It's a fascinating read, and boy does it ruffle some feathers these days. But Luther, in that writing, he's pointing to like Jan Hus and some of these other reformers. So Luther recognizes that there are a group of people that are trying to reform the church. John Calvin is also part of this, who comes a little bit later from Luther. But I want to talk just real briefly about that word Reformation. Luther did not see himself trying to start a new church. He very much was interested in being a conserving movement, but not a preserving movement. Here's what I mean by that. Luther wanted to see a continuity with the past. So Luther would talk about the church fathers, and he would say that he was not starting his own church. He was very much trying to reform the existing church. But he also was not interested in revolution. So the Peasants' War that came about in the 1520s after some of this after Luther posts the 95 Theses, some of the peasants get a hold of Luther's writings and they want to just overthrow everything. And Luther kind of taps the brakes a little bit. He comes out of hiding from the Wartburg and he says, no, we're not trying to create revolution. We're not trying to overthrow all of society. We're not anarchists by any means. What we're trying to do is reform things. So he's certainly not keeping status quo. He's not a preserver of the past, like we want to keep it pristine and don't change anything. Luther very much wanted to change some things. But so Reformation for Luther, I think, and this will be key as we go through this line, was on the one hand, change. Yes, change needs to happen. Why? One of the biggest reasons for Luther was that the papacy of the Roman Catholic Church at the time was really imposing some seriously difficult things for local everyday folks, especially indulgences, and this overbearing power that begins to kind of coerce people or force people into submission was what Luther was really after. That was the kind of the driving force for him in the Reformation, was to get away from some of the things that they were forcing on the church and to come back to what was for Luther the heart of the church: Christ, the forgiveness of sins, the free declaration of grace, and faith. So this overarching power, Luther comes in, says, we're not going to do a revolution and overthrow that power. We want to reform and change things moving on. Luther writes, very interestingly, an essay called On Christian Freedom, or On Christian Liberty. And he has this great line at the beginning that the Christian is both a free Lord who is servant to none, and yet also he is a submissive servant and dutifully serves all people. So Luther's conception of the human being, Luther's conception of the everyday person, was that you could give freedom even to the most uneducated person. There were a lot of people that would have called that dangerous. You can forgive them their sins, and you can trust that they will lead a good life. You can put, Luther even was convinced, you can put the word of God in their hands, and you can trust that because they're baptized, that they have the Holy Spirit. And so we can trust them to carry out this reformation, and we don't need this overarching power to somehow make sure that it continues. So let me just pause there and say, does that all kind of track with your sense of Luther and his overall project of what he's trying to do?
I mean, I feel like you're the sort of scholar here, Ben. Let's be real. I think if I'm listening to this, I want to make sure people hear the frame of reformation, not revolution. I know there's been a few Bitcoin podcasts that talk about that very thing, but even more so if we're assuming we have mostly Western audience listening to us, I feel like our frame of mind is not necessarily a let's stick around and try and change something, but more of a let's blow it up, quit it, and do something else sort of thing, right? So even the Roots of America is a similar sort of thing. But whether it's hey, I don't like my church, I'm not going to stick around and try and make changes. I'm just going to quit and go somewhere else. Or I don't like this, pick your poison. I don't like this restaurant. I'm never coming here. I'm not going to try and be helpful and offer good critiques. That we don't usually have a reformation trying to be in the system that we're in while trying to change it and make it better. And I think that's a very different way of thinking that needs to say, hey, let's pause on that. Let's make sure we have that before we go anywhere else.
Yeah, cancel culture is a great example of the opposite of reformation, right? Cancel culture and revolution very much go together. And they oftentimes start at the kind of grassroots level, where people are frustrated that they don't have the freedoms that they'd like to have. Luther was very, very concerned about that and very sympathetic to that. The Lutheran Reformation and the Reformation in general are by no means a kind of oligarchy, aristocracy, the a bunch of rich people that are saying we need to kind of change society. It very much is a grassroots, but it's very different from cancel culture and revolution. That's a super helpful kind of bringing this all into modern day. David, any thoughts, questions,
Yeah.
making sense so far?
One thing, just to say in addition, complementary to what you said, and it's about Luther, how he was known to be. He was very pastoral. He was part of a local congregation, thought of probably the congregation, the local level, before he thought of, well, I hesitate to say national level. That's how we would think of it. But he was always very local, very pastoral. And that was the challenge, right? That's a huge challenge. If you've got a pastoral guy in the midst of an institution that's becoming more and more institutionalized and centralized all the time, that is a challenge. I mean, I almost am tempted to want the revolution word for our own nation and government at times. I look at the level of problems and the like, it begins to feel intractable to me. But then, and I say this, and I say this in all seriousness, because this came up at our dinner table with an assignment one of the kids had this last year. Then I think of like, is it the preamble words? We the people, right? The way in which the preamble to our Constitution, and then our Constitution as well, is very pastoral. It starts at the level of we the people. It doesn't start at the level of the state. And I'm like, okay, if that remains to be true, then yes, let's reform. There's something truly here to reform. Or I can real quickly dabble on, then I'm going to give it back to you because you've got miles to take us. Think of Bitcoin, and it could sound like a claim of revolution in terms of monetary systems. That might seem true, but I literally love it at the level of reform. And what do I mean by that? The real stuff happening is real people with real labors that actually supports and serves their neighbors and produces fruits. Somehow more comes out of our labor than the input we put in. And that gives us the freedom to store it, to gift it, to use it, and the like. That's an economy, and the economy isn't money. I mean, I want a reform of the money for the real labor that continues to go on, which is also, again, sort of very pastoral, very personal. Real people, real names close to us, as well as all the people far from us. So that for me, that's one of my threads that kind of goes through all, and it connects with what you're saying about Luther and what I know or understand to be true about him as well.
I love that idea that Bitcoin is not revolution because, I mean, it's not Occupy Wall Street. It's not just saying we have to break all this stuff. That was the Occupy Wall Street movement, was like, let's kind of revolt against the Wall Street system. Bitcoin it's a positive force. Let's try to reform society and economy with a whole new method, but it very much it has its roots specifically not in revolution, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Well, we go from Luther and the reformers in the 16th century, the 1500s. So Luther was 1483 to 1546. One other thing about Luther that's important to mention is his use of the printing press and how he was trying to bring about Reformation. Luther specifically did not try to gain office in the highest echelons of the Roman Catholic Church in order to reform it. Instead, his method was to trust lay people and everyday kind of common pastors. And in order to reach them, he used this new technology called the printing press. And the idea of the printing press was take this message, the 95 Theses were printed and then were distributed all over the place. And Luther's writing all kinds of pamphlets using the printing press to get the word out to common everyday people so that Reformation could happen kind of from the grassroots. Well, fast forward not even 100 years, to John Milton. John Milton is a person that a lot of people might know just by name. He was the author of Paradise Lost, right? And he has this wonderful poem about the fall of Satan and everything. It's very complex. I've waded through about half of it, and I need to get back to that at some point. But John Milton wrote another essay that I want to talk about. First, though, his dates. So John Milton was 1608 to 1674. So Luther dies in 1546. John Milton is born 50 or 62 years after that. So just a couple generations. So John Milton writes this little prose essay called Areopagitica, kind of from the Areopagus. The Areopagite was a philosopher. So Milton writes this little treatise called Areopagitica, and here's the problem that he's trying to deal with. In England, the Church of England had said, we're going to license who can use the printing press. So Milton was concerned because there was this power. It wasn't the Roman Catholic Church and the papacy. Now it was the Anglican Church and their Episcopalian system. The bishops were imposing laws with the Parliament on who could print pamphlets. And you can imagine, long before we have the internet, now today everybody can print whatever. Anybody can start a podcast and say whatever they want to say. But back in Milton's day, you could literally be put in prison or killed for publishing the wrong thing. And this was actually a problem because the church was deeming books heretical. And then the authors, if the author's still alive, they're tracking them down. And I've been to Munster where they hung heretics. They put them in this cage way up on the steeple of the church, and they basically left the heretic starve up there until the birds came and picked away their flesh. I mean, talk about inhumane treatment, right? So this is what Milton is writing about. A person that writes a book. Milton's an author. He's concerned for authors' freedom. And so he writes this Areopagitica. Here's, though, how he argues why we need to reform the laws about who gets to use the printing press. He actually says his first argument is that having a licensure or having controls over who has the printing press is what he says, it's an invention of the Council of Trent and the Inquisition. Now, the Council of Trent, Jared and David know from some time at seminary that the Council of Trent famously starts right after Luther dies, and it's the council that the Roman Catholic Church holds essentially to brand Luther and justification by grace through faith alone as heretical. So it's also in the Council of Trent, Milton argues, that this whole idea of we have to lock down the printing press comes about. So Areopagitica, the first argument for why the printing press shouldn't be licensed and controlled by the state is this started under the Roman papacy. Now, Milton is writing to fellow Anglicans who themselves are not lovers of Roman Catholicism. And so he's kind of poking them a little bit, right? So that's his first argument. The second argument is that the reading of non-Christian books is not only should it be allowable, but it's actually good for Christians because it refines them in thinking through the truth. So Milton has this view, much like Luther did, that it's okay to put all kinds of things in the hands of the common people, and we will trust the Word of God. We will trust human reason to kind of figure this stuff out. And it's okay to put books in the hands of common people, and we don't have to have some big apparatus to say, well, you common people, you can read this, but you can't read this. So he thought it was good for Christians to read all kinds of stuff and then have to develop these muscles, my kind of analogy, not his, to be able to flex your muscles and to discern what's true and what's not true. His third argument is, if we're going to uh, prevent a person from sinning by keeping them from bad books, it's a complete misunderstanding of the human being, because John Milton says, as I mean, he's quoting Luther, he's quoting the reformers. Milton is the one that said Wycliffe is the original reformer, but Milton's reading Luther and these Reformation authors, and Milton argues that people who would prevent the printing press don't understand the human being. You can't keep them from evil, because Milton says evil is at their very heart, right? Um, this is an argument that Luther made, that putting people in monasteries and trying to keep them from evil society is no good, because it's not that the evil in society is out there, it's within the human heart. So Milton understands the human being, and he says it's no good if you're going to try to prevent common people from being kind of infiltrated. It's not as if later we would have this argument that the human being is what is called tabula rasa, a blank slate, and eventually down the road. No, from the very beginning, the day that they're born, from the day that they're conceived, even they're born in sin. You can't keep people from sinning by keeping bad stuff out of their hands. They'll find a way to do it. He further says, if you're going to try to ban books to keep people from sinning, you also have to ban all kinds of music. You're going to have to ban all kinds of art. You're going to have to ban dance. You gotta ban universities. So you can see how this argument goes, where all of a sudden, if you're going to ban good Christian people from reading books, then where does it stop, right? So you got to ban all this stuff. And then finally, Milton says this puts every author under the assumption that they're guilty until proven innocent, and it basically distrusts the average person, and doesn't give them the power to navigate problems with the Word of God and human reason. So Milton's argument for why the Anglican Episcopal Church shouldn't ban the printing press is essentially the exact same arguments that Luther is making during the Reformation. So far, so good. Does that make sense? Any insights?
I mean, I think it's helpful. Again, you're drawing the straw, right? The people have the ability and don't need someone else to hold their hand and or force them into something. So Luther, that's talking about church. Here, Milton is talking about information, which is crazy. We could do some sort of side trail about today and censorship too, but that common thread that people have the ability, or at least we should trust them with those things, and then trust the Holy Spirit and all those sort of things to guide people into truth. And I think the connection I would make, at least to Bitcoin here, is that people don't need someone else to tell them what is okay and not okay to choose and use as money. Yep. Right? That I don't need the government to say, no, this is a bad form of money. You should avoid it. Don't look at it. Don't think that you should touch it because it's not good. And why? Well, you should trust us, right? Like, we are the ones who know best. I think that's where we're heading here.
Yeah, that's good. David, any thoughts?
Yeah, I've used that sort of logic though, Jared, as a parent, right? You should trust us. And yet it does occur to me, and we're kind of at the painful portion of all of this. We're very invested in our kids. 20 years invested in the one, 18, 15, and 14 years invested. I haven't added all that up, but that's a few years between the two of us. Very invested in it. You must trust us. And yet the final goal of parenting is to let go. let them off. which is just absolutely terrifying. It's filled with grief at times, but you do it. And maybe the best things in life are like that. I mean, I think that's the way of biology. Trees probably invest in seeds and then let them go, all these sorts of things. But then in a fallen world where stuff happens and there are big bad boogeymen, things to be feared, it's just really tempting to never let go. And to start with the just trust us, to continue with it, and maybe at some point double and triple down on it. So that's one thing that comes to mind, kind of a very familial analogy, parenting, which is I just almost not constantly, I very frequently go back to that sort of place. That comes to mind, but it also reminds me of like just the free market a little bit. And I don't want to push that too far because religion isn't just free market. I mean, in that case, I could be a consumer, a single consumer, and I'm a market of one, and I just created something and it works for me. I don't mean to make all things subjective, but it seems to me something does happen in the free market where if we try and force the market, we get perverse outcomes. But sometimes when you let the market just react, things rise to the surface. So that's the second thing that came to mind as Ben, you were talking. And then the third was Gresham's law, which I hear tossed around a lot in Bitcoin world, which talks about good currency versus bad currency. And I'm thinking about that in terms of good theology, bad theology, true or false, and just trust that the true thing will prevail. You know, the cream, so to speak, rises to the top. I feel it as if I've churned milk and created and made my own butter. Never have, but the cream rises to the top. So those are just me. That's what's going on in my head as you're talking, Ben.
I love it. Milton actually makes this argument that we can trust truth. And by truth, he actually talks about being Jesus Christ, the truth who became incarnate and dwelt for a time among man. And so Milton says, though, we can trust truth to have its way. Now, I think non-religious people could even relate to that and say, like, let truth kind of things will kind of work themselves out, and eventually the person that's telling the lie will be found out, right? Yep. One little quote that as I was reading through this that I realized, from my one of my first classes in undergrad with who is now President Emeritus Dr. Patrick Ferry. Pat Ferry in this history class said this phrase, let truth and falsehood grapple. And the idea was that truth will probably win out and we can trust truth. Well, I had no idea where. I thought Pat Ferry came up with that himself. Come to find out, John Milton wrote it in Areopagitica. Let truth and falsehood grapple. I was so excited to find that little nugget. So another hat tip to Dr. Ferry for teaching me some good stuff in history class. Try to do you proud. Well, we're going to move on from John Milton to another English author. This is kind of how the Reformation comes through England, and I'm doing that for some specific purposes to kind of tie this line. But the next author is another one that you probably know, Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift lived 1667 to 1745. And what is Jonathan Swift's most famous book, or the book that Jonathan Swift is most known for? Gulliver's Travels, right? Gulliver's Travels, where he goes and he meets the Lilliputians and this whole story, right, that a lot of kids read. Well, Jonathan Swift was not just like an author of children's stories. He was actually very much interested in politics. And he writes this little book called A Tale of a Tub, T-U-B, A Tale of a Tub. And he's writing this in the early 1700s. And it's the kind of the craziest book. Jonathan Swift is a satirist, so he's poking all kinds of people. And his whole Gulliver's Travels is really just a veiled way of making fun of all these people. So I mean, in many ways, he's kind of a meme lord. He's just creating all these caricatures and making fun of people. I think he would probably fit very well today. He's very sarcastic. But in this story, A Tale of a Tub, he has three characters. Get this: Peter, Martin or Marty, and Jack. And it's the tale of three brothers that are trying to bring about change. And essentially, Peter is the Roman Catholic Church, and their approach is like kind of top down, a very hierarchical. Jack, the third one, is this kind of revolutionary who's just trying to, I mean, almost like anarchists, like just we don't need any of this. And the middle one is Marty, and it's literally Jonathan Swift writing about Martin Luther. That really is who this Marty is referring to, and he makes some references so that you kind of know, oh, this really is Martin Luther that he's talking about. And he's interested in Martin Luther because Martin Luther is kind of this middle way between the hierarchical top down or the absolutely no law revolutionary anarchist. Martin is this reformer. And so he wants to kind of come alongside things that are already going. He sees the problems, he works on them, and he crafts solutions that might take some time and you might need patience. And so it's not revolt, it's not hierarchical domination, it's this reformation and conserving of what works and is good, and then trying to change what's not working so that things can be better. So Jonathan Swift very much understands, I think, Martin Luther's strategy for reformation. I'm certain that Swift is reading Milton. They're both very much in the Reformation train, and so it makes a lot of sense to me that further down the line, these English authors are going to be drawing from people like John Milton, Jonathan Swift. And so we come to the next person, and that's Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke is said to be the father of what is today called modern conservatism. Now, before you think, oh, I get it, Edmund Burke and Donald Trump. No, there's no connection, and I'm very concerned about Burke. Was not, you can't equate Burke to all Republicans or anything like that. Burke is living in a time in the, so we've kind of gone, the Reformation has aged, and so Burke is living from 1729 to 1797. And in Edmund Burke's lifetime, you can kind of suss out that this is about the same time as Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and Benjamin Franklin are living. During their lifetime happens the French Revolution and then the American Revolution, right? And so people are all asking Edmund Burke, what do you think of the French Revolution, and should we use that model kind of for the American Revolution? So Edmund Burke is trying to craft an argument for how we should not blow everything up and start afresh, and instead he wants to conserve as much as possible, and then the parts that need to be changed, let's make change slowly. Let's try to work this through the regular channels. He doesn't want to see an overthrow of society. But what's really interesting about Edmund Burke, and why I think he's tied back to some of these earlier authors, is this book that I read by Yuval Levine, a contemporary author, called The Great Debate. The Great Debate. And what Yuval Levine says is that it's actually Edmund Burke's view of humanity that leads him to argue the way he argues. So Burke is against revolution, and here's why. The people that were arguing for the French Revolution, the American Revolution, Levine has kind of a central character for revolution, and it's Thomas Paine. He wrote that book, Common Sense, which we probably talked about just ever so briefly in elementary school. So here's Thomas Paine's view of the human. They're essentially a blank slate. And if they go bad, the best thing to do is kind of push them out of the way and start afresh. So if things have kind of gone to shit, then you clear everything out, and people are by their nature, for the most part, Thomas Paine argues, good. And so if you just kind of do away with all the institution, all the bad stuff, all the bureaucracy, and you get back to a few folks that can start again, then you'll have a good thing, because human beings are by their nature essentially good. You can see how that argument leads toward get all the bad people out and let's put new, better, good people in who will make everything better. The problem, of course, that Edmund Burke realizes is no, Burke is not a super religious guy, but he does still hold to this basic belief that human beings at their core are sinful and you can't get sin out of the human heart. And so Burke actually argues that we shouldn't disband all these good organizations, even if they've kind of gone sideways,
still gone for you,
because they actually help to keep human beings from going too far afield, from getting too crazy. Lutherans would say this is like the curb, right? We talk about the law as curb, mirror, and guide. The law as curb says we're going to keep these bumpers in place so that you don't go too far out of either place. So let me pause there and see if so. Burke realized that the problem with the human heart is that there's sin within, and you can't get it out by sort of pushing bad people aside and putting new people in. What's this modern song? It's a few years old. We're not broken, we're just bent. Do you remember that song?
No, I don't, but
we're not broken, we're just bent, and we can learn to love again. That's kind of at Thomas Paine's core of his view of the human being. We're not broken, we're just bent. Maybe we went a wrong way, and we'll just kind of bend us back into shape or push the bad people out and let some new folks come in. So Burke thinks that's a terrible idea, and he actually wants these human institutions that have come to power over the years because they act as a curb. Did you hear me earlier talk about that? I think that was right when I was freezing up. So Lutherans talk about the law as a curb, right? A curb, a mirror, or a guide. The law as curb says a curb does what? It keeps you from going off the road. Well, Burke said institutions actually help us from going off the road. So it's good for there to be these institutions that exist to kind of keep people going in a basic direction, but they need to be guided. A car, you don't just let it run. Somebody's got to actually drive the thing. So there's no reason to blow up the entire road and to do away with cars. No, let's just jump in the car and steer it better. So that's this great debate, and Yuval Levine says it's essentially the debate between what is called classical liberalism. Human beings are good, let's revolt and put better leaders in place and everything will be great, versus classical conservatism. Institutions are good because they keep people more or less in line, but it's not status quo. We have to continually reform them. Let me pause there, come up for air, and ask, is this kind of tracking along as I'm making the case from Luther to now we got to the American Revolution with Edmund Burke?
So you tell me if I'm hearing you right, that if the first two are the threat of, hey, we can trust people to be sort of have the information. We're moving from, if we do trust them, what do we do when we don't like what they're doing? And now we're trying to figure out, hey, does that mean we just need to revolt and, get rid of them so that then we can put our people in power? Or do we need to use institutions to help sort of play that role? Is that kind of where you're going? Is that the next step in the process, or am I missing something?
Well, I mean, I think in some ways, some people have critiqued Burke that he has too high of an estimation of institutions and maybe too low of an estimation of the kind of average Joe. And so I think that might be a fair critique, but what Burke is really convinced of is that there's no such thing as a good person that's just as a person far better than the next person. So it's really an argument against revolution more than I think, in some ways, John Milton and is very much more a kind of a spokesman for freedom, liberty, which eventually gets to be what some people call liberalism. But Edmund Burke was very much also a proponent of freedom, just not revolutionary freedom. He wanted people to, there's a lot of freedom in a curb, right? You can drive your car all over the place. So having some curbs is just, don't go off into this ditch. If you get off the road there, you might plunge yourself into a cliff. So still arguing for freedom, still believing that we can trust the average person, to do things like be part of local legislation and that sort of thing. Edmund Burke is not trying to prop up monarchy over against the peasants. I don't read him to be arguing that way.
So then it's more of the sort of the earlier idea we talked about is trying to stick around and reform something, right? Rather than just revolt and, hope that the next guy is as good as we want him to be.
Good. Keep going?
I think so.
All right. So a couple other figures that are really important in this time frame, and I'm just starting to spend a little time reading Alexis de Tocqueville. He writes this book called Democracy in America, and it's a study of how America works. And yes, there was an American Revolution, and there was an overthrow of the king, but I wonder if even calling it a revolution betrays a certain kind of thinking. And I think there was an alternative view to what happened when the Americans said, we don't really need a king, we'll kind of go our own way. Alexis de Tocqueville is going to make the argument that, and I don't think anybody would argue this, that America went from not having the British king over them to anarchy. It wasn't anarchy. Right. It was, and so Alexis de Tocqueville is coming in. His dates are 1805 to 1859. He's writing in 1830, which is fascinating. It's well enough after the so-called revolution that something had to be put in its place, but it's prior to the Civil War. And so de Tocqueville is trying to figure out what makes America work. And he's a Frenchman, so he's even kind of critiquing the French and the French system of government and essentially all of Western Europe, because he sees some things in America that he thinks Europe could actually learn from. And I've been fascinated, as I know that Tocqueville read a lot of Edmund Burke, and that Edmund Burke was kind of the master for Alexis de Tocqueville. So de Tocqueville starts talking about how America is not centralized. He specifically talks about centralization, and he prizes the decentralization in America. Here's his fascinating argument that the real thing that makes America work is the township. The reason that America works, de Tocqueville says, is that people in these local towns, they kind of have figured out local government, and they essentially need almost nothing from the federal government. So he says the health of America is based on its townships. They have figured out how to police themselves with a jury system where common people sit in and they sit through trials, and that has the way of kind of keeping people in line without having some big dominating force come in and just like bust heads, right? And so he says even the work of like the national government, it works because it has so little power and it is in charge of so very little. And so de Tocqueville is fascinated by the average person and their capacity to essentially govern themselves and to be industrious and to produce good things. To run a node, for example, to start thinking a little bit more toward Bitcoin. So de Tocqueville says townships are the health of America, and he said if America, this was fascinating to me, if America ever gets to the point where their local townships don't function well anymore, the country will come apart. Yikes. Think about how much interest is there in getting involved in local government. I think we need some movements to bring back local things. Wendell Berry is a huge advocate of the local and how local government works. And you don't very well do revolutions in hometowns. Everybody's still going to live there, right? And so it's very rare that you would have a revolution in a hometown. It's much more this reforming and trying to conserve the good things. And so de Tocqueville is a fascinating author for the sake of, he's also arguing for slow reform, trusting the individual. Yes, there's bad out there in the world, but we can trust people to kind of put forward jury and that sort of thing to keep things moving forward. But the big thing is no centralized government. That's what de Tocqueville says is so important about the American project. One final author, just briefly, is referred to as Lord Acton. Lord Acton lived from 1834 to 1902. And he is the one that classically coined the phrase, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So if you go and read any of Lord Acton, he's all about freedom and he's all about trusting the individual person. But and so his big thing is he does not want centralized government, because anytime that you put all the power in the hands of these people to somehow police all the bad people for you, you end up with a corrupt government, because every human being is corrupt to their core. So Acton was one of these kind of founding thinkers of this, what would be called classical conservatism, not neoconservatism that a lot of people think of today. This finally comes to Friedrich Hayek. Friedrich Hayek is this author who lives in Germany during the Second World War and right after the Second World War. He's actually an Austrian, German speaker, but an Austrian. Friedrich Hayek is interested in economy, and he writes a book called The
Road to Serfdom.
The Road to Serfdom. Hayek is going to take all of this political thinking from Burke and thinkers like this, and he is essentially arguing that, and he's arguing this from the place of the Nazis. He watched how both socialism and National Socialism had these very centralized views that the government can kind of take care of everything. That National Socialism, as you know, is kind of this big, powerful man that's going to kind of clean up society and drive out all the quote unquote bad dudes. Well, that's a more recent way to put it. But Hayek watched that whole thing and he said the whole thing from beginning to end was problematic because of its centralization. And what we need instead is to decentralize things and let the common person figure out the economy on their own. And so free market kind of flows out from there. I'm not going to go into how the cypherpunks grabbed on to Friedrich Hayek because that has been recently done by lots of Bitcoiners. The whole cypherpunk movement they're huge fans of Friedrich Hayek. The book, the Genesis book, that's recently come out about the story of how Bitcoin started among all these thinkers. He kind of starts with Hayek and some of these thinkers and moves forward to show that Hayek was kind of the central thinker. But I've taken us from Martin Luther to John Milton and Jonathan Swift, Edmund Burke to Alexis de Tocqueville and Lord Acton to Friedrich Hayek. And I would argue that although somebody like Friedrich Hayek is not at all religious, he still takes the basic concept of Reformation, the freedom of the individual, the importance of reason, and letting individuals reason their way out of things. It's not so much trust truth and Jesus Christ as capital T truth. It's more trust reason, but there's still this basic conserving Reformation movement. And I will kind of pause there and ask about questions on the history stuff, and then I want you guys to kind of help me make all these connections to Bitcoin and its way of thinking today. Any questions about kind of the line of history that I drew?
So you have traced a line of history, but would you say this is the line of history between the two events, or a line of history?
I would say this is a line of history. There's undoubtedly other thinkers that are in there. Friedrich Hayek is drawn on a whole bunch of people, and it's not quite like Hayek is just reading Alexis de Tocqueville and then writing his book. It's trying to pick some key figures in what I think is a long line of kind of a reforming, conserving, non-revolutionary approach to how people live in the world and especially how people think about government.
And maybe we could say two complementary things to that then as well, that ideas matter, or the complement to that would be ideas have consequences. That was the one thing. And of course, I had a second thing, and it has now since escaped me. But, and ideas have parents. Ideas are themselves progeny, descendants from. We could probably, as hearers, there's serious academics that could be just totally grooving with you, Ben, and want to go back further. Like, let's go back pre-Reformation now. Let's draw it that way, and let's conjecture about where things go from here. And there's others who might say this is really interesting. Others like, this is pretty highbrow, but I think I got it. Not my normal day today. But we could choose other things in our lives and see those who came before us and those who are coming after. A love of baseball in the given family. It could go back father to the father of father, but it could be child to father-in-law or cousin. We can make strange jumps, but there's connections in our world. We ourselves are probably evidence of that. And so the invitation would be to say, if that's true of each of us in our unique ways, if somebody gave us a blank check, could we tell stories of this being connected to that, went all the way back? You've done that for us here. Concerning really some serious matters, really. On the one hand, we could say, going back to the Reformation, the church was at the center of culture and life then, and it's not now. Oh, so Ben, you just traced how the church isn't important. Well, that's not what you're trying to say. I know that for a fact. It's much about the church being important, but about the gospel that constitutes the church, that central claim of Christianity, that God came our way to face our rebellion, to take the consequences of it upon himself. So in that way, that continues, and that's the fruit of the Reformation, is this Christian proclamation we have, and we want to give it. Whether we proclaim it from up front in church, or the denomination head does it, or grandma does it to grandchild, or gentleman does it to neighbor children, we want to proclaim this, whether centralized or uncentralized. So your claim isn't that, but you're also having fun with this, saying, hey, if the Reformation, if there's something sympathetic about the Reformation, the historic Reformation, Protestant Reformation, and then history marches on as it has till now, even the Reformation has children, even if they're kind of strange grandchildren or seemingly strange. And one of those, this is what you're suggesting. This is what you're proffering for us, is that one of those strange children, or maybe one of the strange grandparents of Bitcoin, is the Reformation itself.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's because Luther especially, but the reformers in general, cared very much about not just like me and God and matters of faith and spirituality and who cares about all this earthly stuff. Luther very much cared about how reform comes about and how what's the state of society like, what's the state of politics like. And so yes, this isn't, we eventually ended with not talking about the church, but I think it would essentially be Luther saying, I care about how economy works and I care about how people exchange goods. And that's a thing that Christians should care about, even if their neighbor that participates in that economy isn't a Christian. We should still be for good economy. And so Luther's Reformation kind of has benefits for the neighbor that through the centuries eventually kind of bless us with some fruits, even maybe Bitcoin.
So I have one question maybe before we make the turn there, that as we've talked in the past and as you just traced so nicely, the question I might have is, hey, that sounds a lot like you're just a libertarian, like, you just don't want government at all. So maybe can you speak to like someone who might not, identify in that way? Like, how does whether I'm a lifelong Democrat, lifelong Republican, how might I still participate or hear this thread as valuable if I'm not going to end in the place of, well, yeah, I don't like the government. I think we should all not have government in a libertarian sense of the word.
Yeah, so I mean, one sense, I don't think it's libertarian in that. I mean, libertarian can have this kind of revolutionary, don't tread on me kind of anti-government, almost anarchy. And there were admittedly some people in the cypherpunk movement that were anarchists and that were very much against government. Now, in some ways, I suppose that if you took somebody who wasn't a Lutheran and you gave them some books of Martin Luther, and you just let them start reading some of the things that Luther says at his most spicy moments about the papacy, you might also think that Luther is kind of an anarchist. We know that he wasn't, because as the Lutheran Reformation grew, he wasn't just like, oh, every person for himself, who cares? He actually created like his own. There was a need for government and for people, supervisors, and people to organize and this sort of thing. Luther wasn't opposed to that. So yeah, this isn't like I don't hear Luther arguing for libertarianism. I also think, sometimes the conservatives today are not always known for caring about the everyday person, especially caring about the poor. And I hear in Luther's Reformation and this move through the years, in many ways, it's a concern for the everyday person who feels like they are kind of disenfranchised, and in many ways, that care for the disenfranchised or for the dispossessed, those who don't have possessions. Uh, it's classic that a lot of people would think, oh, that's kind of the realm of the Democrats or social liberals. But I think people that might align with this could see that Luther and those after him care very much for the everyday person, and they trust the everyday person, and they want what's great for the everyday person. So it's not just like pull your own self up by your own bootstraps, and if you don't do that, who cares, and we'll leave you behind. This is actually, the Reformation movement starts because of a care for the common person and not wanting them to be left behind or trampled upon. It's how they solve the problem, though, that is so different from just libertarian anarchy or revolution, which oftentimes revolution, this is Alexis de Tocqueville's critique of revolution and Edmund Burke's, is that as soon as the revolution's over, revolutionaries are usually the ones that put in an even stronger government, and they institute this like extremely overbearing, because they think that those people were bad and we're the good guys. And you always end up with a bad thing if you think those guys are bad and we're the good guys, until you start leading, and then people critique you. So I don't know, Jared, does that help? So that I'm really trying to be careful not to align this with the modern Republican Party or something. I think Hayek and Burke would have real problems with, and as well as the reformers going further back, with some of the things that the modern day Republican Party and certainly the Democratic Party have glammed onto.
Yeah, I think my main concern as I think about people listening is hey, we talk so much about like decentralization versus centralization that I don't think any of us are advocating for no government, right? That it's just hey, what's the necessarily right amount and what's the decentralized nature of the various parts in which they have control over. So as you hear it, it's not like we don't need this, it's not good. It's just we're thinking about how and what should they have control and say over. So I think you did well, Ben.
Well, and I think putting it that way, what's helpful about how David articulated early on, that what we want is not to kind of overthrow the government or overthrow all authority. We want a better system. So Bitcoiners want a system. There is a system in Bitcoin. There is essentially law in Bitcoin. There's an order and a system for how things work. It's not that we want no system. That would be to say, let's just blow up the whole Bitcoin thing and let's not have money or something like that. Bitcoin is a system. It's just a hunger for a better system, but most especially a system that is for the everyman and doesn't have loads of kind of imposing coercive power trying to police it and keep it in place.
I like that. Bitcoiners often talk about decentralization, but if we don't say more, whether in that community or a community trying to listen into the Bitcoin community, it could sound like hyper individualism or hyper atomistic, segregated humanity. And it turns out the decentralization that is being talked about is cooperative and connected decentralization. I'm just throwing a few adjectives at it there. Like there isn't, we're all participating in it, and there isn't one central spot, typically the person who has the power, who says, you just got to trust me. And that, again, is a little bit more full circle in our conversation here. You just have to trust me. The Protestant Reformation continues to understand that, or at least run in that tradition, whether understand itself or not, right? Because, for instance, we don't say just believe. We say Christ rose, and there's good reason to believe it. We don't say, we might say, come to church and hear with me, but it's not because church is the only place where those promises can be proclaimed by only a professional class of proclaimers. There is a professional class of proclaimers, you might say that, but they're not the only ones capable of saying it, or even deputized, you might say, to say it. There's others as well. So the idea of it being decentralized, I don't think needs to war against collections of people, meaningful communities. It could sound like that. Admittedly.
Yeah, that's really helpful. One thing that I thought of as an application toward Bitcoin, taking this conversation, is this question of, is Bitcoin too complicated for the everyday person? Maybe we shouldn't trust individuals, and we need kind of this, a mechanism that if somebody messes up a transaction, that we can just, lean on this bigger government, or the big person up that has all the Bitcoin code, and they can just fix it for us. And and I think this conversation leads me to be even more convinced that, yeah, it's a bit of work to understand how Bitcoin works and how to do it, but Bitcoin essentially trusts the everyday person to manage their finances and to kind of figure it out, and so puts all the tools in the everyday person's hands and says, yeah, you'll figure this out.
I heard recently, and I'll offer it here as if it were just my own. It's not. Turns out it's a thought that I have, that I'm standing on the shoulders of another, hence this conversation here. But Bitcoin actually works the way you thought money worked when you were a kid. Either you have that penny, that nickel, that quarter, that dime in your possession, or you do not. It is either belongs to you or it belongs to somebody else. You didn't give much thought to it, but if pressed on the matter, you would have thought there was only so much of it. And the question is, what's my slice of the whole? You would have thought that as a child, if given the right questions and prodding to come to that. So yeah, it actually, it seems strange, but it actually, the more I study it, behaves like I grew up thinking money behaved. It's only in adult world where I start trying to understand the present system, the just trust me system, the centralized ledger system that works on something called fractional reserve banking, that I say, like, record scratch, wait, what? It works how? It turns out both of them require a lot of thinking and some work to understand. But the more I understand about Bitcoin, the more it behaves in sort of the honest way that I thought money behaved when I was young.
Yeah, that's good.
Even more so too, like the concern of giving people the scriptures in their hand, right, to actually read for themselves. You could say, well, that's dangerous because the Bible needs to be read in community, and all that is true, right? That people have justified many evil things using the scriptures. But in the same way, it's like, yeah, we're going to give people money and to be able to do in their own hands what they want, right? So the sort of critique of Bitcoin as well, doesn't that mean then terrorists can use it, and all these evil people can use it? And of course we could say, well, sure, they can use fiat too, but at the same point, it's kind of a similar argument. Like, if we want the people to be able to have it, that means we need to sort of unleash it as it is. And that means good people get to use it, but it also means the sinful, broken people, like we all are, really also have access to it as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, so yeah, somebody might use it to buy drugs on the internet, but somebody else might use it to buy way too much property and way too big of a house, and it's not against the law, but it's pretty selfish. And so there's no getting around. We're all sinful in all the things that we do with money. except for probably giving it away, are in some ways tainted with sin. The other thing is, with every other monetary system, this has always been the case. The US dollar gets used for lots of evil purposes, just like some Bitcoins have. And so, yeah, you make a good point there, Jared. I had to think of, like, it gets thrown around a lot, but the Benedict option, which is kind of a modern day, let's create some kind of enclave where we kind of push the evil out. And the problem is that the evil is right here in my own heart. And like G.K. Chesterton said to the editors of the newspaper who asked, "What's the problem with the world?" And he said, "I have to, confess that, sir, I'm the problem."
Or watch, if you want to see movie form of that, a good movie depiction of it, I think, or food for thought that you can then talk about, is The Village by M. Night Shyamalan. Great instance of that. Yeah. Well, Ben, bring it home for us.
Yeah, so it's just to say, look, the Bitcoin is this very interesting, very new phenomenon, and yet in many ways it's a very old idea, and it's actually not a scary brand new thing. It actually runs, for me at least, in the things that I've become convinced in life, it runs in the direction of a lot of other people that I have paid attention to, that I care deeply for, and I see have produced good fruit, not great fruit. They're sinners, all of them, but it's a direction that I particularly want to run in, and so maybe Lutherans shouldn't hate Bitcoin if it's running in the same direction as the Lutheran Reformation. So, great episode, fun to be with you and get some of my goofy thoughts out into the ether and maybe out from just clinking around in my head. And we'll, I promise, get back to more tangible episodes that you can actually do something with, rather than just head in the clouds episodes. But it's been fun to do this one. Keep thinking, keep researching, and we'll be back with another episode. Take care.